As we look at this contrast in Christ's life and Herod's life between the weak and the strong, Christ being the weak, but actually he was strong, and Herod being the apparently strong, but actually he was nothing, I think all of us should reconsider which direction we're going. Let's go back to Matthew, and let me just, it's going to be hard to get all of Herod's life done because, huge books are written on him, but Matthew 2, let me just run you through some contrast between the two choices. And like I like to often remind you, we only have two choices in life. Either we're going to please God or we're going to please what we want ourselves. And that's what these two men are reflecting to us, Christ and Herod. And we need to ask ourselves, who are we choosing to be like? One little choice at a time. Are you choosing bit by bit by bit to be like Herod or to be like Christ? It's our collection of choices. Would the collective choices of our life be more pleasing self, most often a type of Herod life, or is it pleasing God, most often a type of Christ life? And it doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter if you are vocationally in God's work or just spiritually called to do that with a secular job. We each are making a whole bunch of little choices to be Herod-like, please ourselves, kind of that's the basic framework of our choices, or pleasing God. And we need to ask ourselves which way we're going. Which way is our life headed? Are we going Herod's way or Christ's way? Jesus and Herod were opposites, morally, culturally, spiritually, and in their worldly status. Number one, Herod was choosing to live for self as one of the world's greatest builders. Now, you could be one of the world's greatest builders and live for Christ, but he chose to live for self. And what's amazing is how much he poured his life into it. And I've told you before, Herod's family actually were from Cyprus, where Barnabas was from. And there in Cyprus, his great either grandfather or great-grandfather had discovered copper, and they had a huge mining concession on that island. That's where his wealth comes from, and his grandfather and father had used that to finance their exploits and became military, political men, and finally he was at the top, as we find him in the New Testament. But Herod chose to live for self as a great builder. So he built buildings for himself. He built the Temple Mount. We still see the foundation to it, and it's unbelievable to see what it is, how massive that structure was. It's an engineering marvel to this day, with 600-ton foundation stones that they still speculate exactly how he moved those things into place. They are so massive, no motorized, no hydraulic, no engineering vehicle today could lift and place that stone as it was placed. And so we don't know exactly how he did it. And all of that precision still stands 2,000 years later. So he chose to live for self as one of the world's greatest builders of all times. Masada evokes wonder. It's a self-contained water system and agricultural system on top of a mountain in the most deadly hot and dry spots on earth. And it was self-sustaining. The winter rains would go into these multi-million-gallon holding tanks that could be accessed from up above on the mountain, and they could grow all the food they needed. They could live indefinitely in the middle of the most treacherous spot on earth, the lowest, hottest, bleakest, saltiest, deadest parts, called the Dead Sea. And right there, he'd made an oasis. What an amazing engineer he was. Another building he built was Caesarea. The buildings of Caesarea, it's still there today, the ruins of it. It had the only ocean-based sewer system in the world. When the tides would rise twice a day, they rose up underneath the sewer system of the city, and they came up just to the right height to clean out all the storm drains, all the septic systems of every house, and it took it out to sea twice a day. How would you like to have a system where it was constantly renewed and cleansed with salt water, taking away all of the filth of that city and renewing it twice a day? He engineered that, and it's an amazing system, and there's a lot more that's there. He built his palace out in the sea. He had a secret under the palace seaport where he always had a getaway boat so that no one could ever endanger his life, he could sail off. An amazing man. The Herodian, that was his first fortress palace. He built that 10 miles from Jerusalem. Built it like his own mountain. That's where he was buried. They found his body 2 years ago. That incredible place was the third largest palace ever built in the ancient world. And those are just 4 of his building projects. He had many more. He was one of the greatest builders. Herod constructed these palaces. They appeared impregnable. He wielded absolute power. By earthly measure, Herod had it all. But when you contrast him with Christ, Herod had nothing. Jesus, who slept in a manger, looked like nothing. He never held any status. He never possessed anything. Even his clothing was taken away and repossessed at the cross. But yet, he holds eternal glory and unending authority, not because of what he held on to, because he didn't grasp it. He surrendered to his Father's will. Secondly, Herod chose to live for self as one of the most insecure people. Now, maybe you don't relate with the great builder. Maybe you relate more with his insecurities. But there's a lesson from everything. Although Herod had Rome on his side, although he had vast armies at his disposal, and although he ruled more territory than almost any king, except for a couple, David, Solomon, and maybe one of the Jeroboams, Herod had more land than any of the rest. And yet he was so insecure. He never was peaceful. He imagined constant threats at every corner. He cruelly suppressed any foe, whether they were real or just imagined it. He was absolutely insecure. I mean, you see him in the second chapter. I mean, he's enraged. He's killing the babies. He's angry. He is upset at the wise men. He's upset at the religious leaders. He's just constantly insecure. In fact, one of his greatest foes, by his own admission, the person he feared the most was a woman. You all have heard of her. Her name was Cleopatra. I remember she was the beauty queen, and she wanted part of his territory because around the Dead Sea where his Masada was the only place that cosmetics of the best form were made in the ancient world. And she was really into that, and she wanted that. She was always sending her army up, testing the border. And he was very insecure about Cleopatra. And so Herod was insecure. He wasn't truly a descendant of David. He shouldn't have been king. He was insecure because his life revolved around himself. He measured his life in what he owned, what he controlled, how much power he had, how much pleasure, how vast his possessions. That's what he measured life in. Doesn't that sound like 21st century America? Don't we measure people by how much power they have, how much wealth they have, how many possessions? Don't we measure people by their cars and by their houses and by their clothes, by their perceived power? Often we do in our culture. But Jesus had true security. It came from doing God's will, not possessing anything. It came by giving, not by receiving. It came by sacrifice, not by taking. Jesus, who was born according to the Father's will, had true security. Though no one accepted him, though no one really followed him deeply, even his own disciples ran away in the end, and even though he was ultimately universally rejected by the nation, Jesus had true security. Thirdly, Herod lived for self, not only in his insecurity in his building, but he lived for himself and proved to be what I would call the world's greatest failure. Because Herod could have been the one to welcome Jesus Christ. I mean, he was given on a platter one of the great opportunities to welcome the God of the universe who came to his doorstep. And he could be always remembered for that rather than for killing. I mean, most people don't even remember his buildings. Most people today couldn't even point out something Herod built. But everybody remembers. Isn't he the one that killed the babies? That's his notoriety. Though Herod built to rival the greatest exploits that were ever recorded, he only managed to become one of the greatest failures. Herod and his family got as close to Jesus as anyone could. Yet they all died hopelessly lost, some eaten by worms, and horribly empty. He was a colossal failure. Herod died in the agony of a dissipated body, hated by his own family, the ones that were still alive. He killed most of his family. He was hated by those who survived. He had the blood of many on his hands as a murderer. All that Herod had, he lost because Herod lived only for himself. He measured life only by his own measure. He satisfied himself only if it was his purpose that was being fulfilled. That's what selfishness is all about. Measuring life, how it turns out for me, not for another, not for God. Jesus, totally opposite to Herod, died on a cross in agony, not for himself, but for others. And we celebrate that. He was surrounded by sorrowing and loving disciples. Jesus chose to hang and take away our sin because everything Christ had, he kept forever because he sacrificed it to God. He said, all that you've given me, I'll never lose because I've received it from you. I return to you, and all I have is yours. And that is a lesson for us. Jesus lived for God. He served others. He did God's will. What a contrast of the colossal failure, the greatest failure, Herod, and Christ. And every day we have the choice, little choices, to be pleasing self, like Herod, or pleasing God, like Christ. Herod's life is really one of the greatest lessons in the Bible. Just as Herod's buildings towered over the New Testament times, and just as Jesus and Herod were vastly different, the lessons of his life are immense and unforgettable. In fact, usually Herod is one of the great lessons for anybody that goes to Israel, because when you go to the Holy Land, you're surrounded by little reminders of his life. Herod spent his life trying to defy nature. He spent his fortune building beautiful buildings of marble and of massive stone blocks. Herod sought only self-promotion and power through all of his buildings. He built a temple to God, and he built a temple to the Roman emperor. He wanted God to be worshipped, and he wanted Caesar to be worshipped. He didn't care. He had no loyalty except to himself and to his plans.